Hello everyone, welcome to the monthly NRHS Iowa Chapter YouTube slideshow. If you're interested in more information about the Iowa Chapter, please visit iowanrhs.com. There you can join the chapter or renew your membership and order any of the great products that the Iowa Chapter has to offer, including DVDs and photo collections. Please enjoy the program this month and consider visiting iowanrhs.com. Hello everyone, this is the July 2022 Iowa Chapter NRHS and Cedar Rapids Rail Fans YouTube slideshow presentation. This month we have Thomas Dyrek with us. He is going to be talking about the Toledo Peoria Western and kind of the history of the railroad and a little bit of their more modern operations. Before we jump into the slideshow today, I know there's a lot of people that were out chasing the Iowa Interstate QJ just this last weekend as we're recording it. It's literally the day after they backed it into the shop at Silvis. And Thomas, before we started here, you were out there chasing it as well this weekend? Is that right?
Yep.
All right. You get any good photos out of it? Good run-bys?
Yeah, it was a little difficult to chase because the traffic was a little crazy, but we got a few good run-bys in.
Good deal. All right, well, why don't you go ahead and we're going to flip over to your first slide here and take it away. Tell us about the Toledo Peoria Western. There we go.
All right, well, hello everybody. My name's Thomas Dyrek. Some of you may know a few years ago I started up the TPNW Historical Society after it had been defunct for a few years, and this presentation I'm about to give, I've shown it to a few different groups, and it's going to be interesting giving it to a rail fan group for a change because every group I've presented to before aren't really knowledgeable about railroad terms. So I'll say a technical thing and I'll look at the audience and they'll be like, speak English. So this will be interesting to be able to talk trains. So here we go.
Yeah, we are always happy to talk trains here on the Iowa Chapter YouTube channel. Yes.
Yeah. So a little background about how I got into the TPNW. The guy on the left is my third great grandfather, Charles Orlando Scoville. He worked for the Toledo, Peoria, and Warsaw, which was a predecessor to the modern day TPNW, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And my grandma, she's a genealogist, and she told me about our connection with the TPNW, so that sparked an interest. I've been a rail fan my whole life, so I just started to focus on the TPNW quite a bit. The photo on the right is me standing next to an old TPNW speeder shed, so I just love all things TPNW. And I'm gonna, I know that the slideshow is gonna be limited with the amount of history because I could just go on for hours and hours and hours about the TPNW. So if you have any questions when this airs on YouTube, I'm going to try to be in the live chat answering questions. So if you have any, just feel free to ask them in the chat. So for those who are unfamiliar with the TPNW, this is kind of a general overview of where they ran. If you can see on the left there, they started out in Keokuk, Iowa, and went east, basically across the entirety of central Illinois to, at one point, Logansport, Indiana, but that only lasted for a few years as the original TPNW was still a thing. But we'll get into all the track acquisitions and the mergers and everything. So part one, we're going to talk about the early years. The TPNW started off as the Peoria and Aquaka Railroad. It was chartered on February 12th, 1849, and they were going to build a line from Peoria to Aquaka, Illinois, but the village of Aquaka, for whatever reason, did not want their railroad going through their town, so they wound up building to Burlington, Iowa instead. And later on, Oquawka got a branch line from the Burlington, so I'm not entirely sure if they had a change of heart towards trains or whatever. But like so many railroads of the 19th century, the P&O started to get into financial trouble. I could go on for hours about the details of it, but basically what happened was they started in Peoria, made it to Burlington, then they started building east from Peoria, and they took out a loan from another railroad to finish a section, and they weren't able to pay back the loan, so their Peoria to Burlington route was seized, and that really messed up their financial state. So eventually it was reorganized as the Logansport, Peoria, and Burlington Railway, and the LP&B was very short-lived. It lasted from about 1860 to, I believe, 1862 or 63, and it also went belly up, and then it was reorganized again as the Toledo, Peoria, and Warsaw. As I mentioned earlier, this was what my great-great-great-grandfather worked for. And then the Toledo, Peoria, Warsaw was the first of these companies to be able to hang on for a while, and they were able to get track laid west of Peoria again, eventually out to Keokuk, and they managed to do well for a while, but then again they also went belly up, and it was finally reorganized as the Toledo, Peoria, and Western in 1887. So this is one of the earliest known photographs of a TP&W train. This was taken in, believe it or not, I think this is in downtown Peoria, what is now the big riverfront area with all the malls and whatnot. It's pretty cool to look at this and then think about what's there now, all kinds of skyscrapers and modern buildings. This is on the west end at La Harpe, Illinois. This photo isn't the best quality, but it shows the depot there at La Harpe. It was built by the Toledo, Peoria, and Warsaw, and right around the time the Toledo, Peoria, and Western took over, this depot was hit by lightning and burned down, but they were able to build. I haven't been able to determine exactly what happened, but they either rebuilt it to look exactly as it did or built an entirely new depot exactly like the old one. So not long after the Toledo, Peoria, and Western took over, they experienced the first of many wrecks in their history. This is perhaps the most famous, the Great Chatsworth Wreck of August 10th, 1887. There was a eastbound excursion train that was running from Peoria to Niagara Falls, New York, and just east of Chatsworth, Illinois. Earlier in the day, a section crew was burning brush around a trestle bridge, per orders from the president of the TP&W, who wanted to eliminate all fire danger for the excursion train. And they burned brush around the bridge, but again, this is something that's been more or less lost to history exactly what happened, but somehow the control burn spread to the bridge, and the bridge did not collapse, but it was weakened and could no longer support a train. So the excursion train's coming along and it passes over the bridge. It had two engines. The first made it over, and then the bridge collapsed under the weight of the rest of the train, and about 85 people were killed and dozens more were injured, and the Great Chatsworth Wreck remains, I believe, one of the worst rail disasters in United States history. So this photograph is at Kentland, Indiana on the Pennsylvania Railroad. This actually has a TPNW connection, though at the time of this photograph, nothing here had anything to do with the TPNW. Eventually, the railroad through here was acquired by the TPNW. We'll get to that later. But the depot on the right, about 1912, I don't know exactly why, but the town of Kentland built a new depot, and the old wood one here was moved to Effner, Indiana, right on the Illinois-Indiana state line, and it became a TPNW depot because at Effner, for many years, that's where the TPNW's property ended, and east of Effner, the tracks were owned by the Pennsylvania. So more depots along the TPNW. This is Fairbury Union Depot in Fairbury, Illinois. This was built in 1904, and for whatever reason, it was demolished about 30 years later in 1934, and the bricks were used to construct a church in town. Passenger service was eliminated right before it was demolished, but we'll get to that later. Here is Keokuk Union Depot, built in 1891. TPNW trains served this along with the Wabash, Rock Island, and Burlington. And this depot is still there. It's being restored. Way back out east, this is at Sheldon, Illinois, at a junction with the New York Central. This depot was built in 1904, and 2 years later they built an identical station at Watseka, a little ways up the tracks at another junction. And while the Sheldon depot does not stand anymore, the Watseka depot has been turned into a museum. Early steam engines. This is a 280, photographed, I want to say about 1915 or so. I'm not entirely sure. This is at Peoria Union Depot, and the TPNW at this time was not doing the best financially again, and you can see that they're using some older locomotives, while the Illinois Central locomotive in the background on the right is a lot more up to date in terms of locomotive technology. In 1905, the TPNW got a few 460 passenger engines, and here is a photograph of them at a very small locomotive shop in Effner, right across the state line from where the depot that I just mentioned stood. The roundhouse here was actually the second roundhouse on the site. The first one had fallen apart. It was built, I believe, during the Logansport, Peoria, and Burlington era. It was made of wood, and that just deteriorates over time. So they built this new brick roundhouse, but it too is long gone, as is the turntable. So like I mentioned earlier, about 1915, 1916, the TPNW started to get into financial trouble again. And in 1917, they went into receivership and were taken over by the United States Railroad Administration because the TPNW provided an important bypass around the congested Chicago rail network, and the government recognized this and needed the TPNW to stay open to assist with the war effort. And eventually the USRA returned it to private ownership, but when they did, it was in even worse shape than what the USRA got. So it was about to go bankrupt again, and there were some newspapers at the time that were saying scrappers were taking interest in the railroad so they could just completely abandon it and scrap everything. But, in 1926, George P. McNear, a businessman from New York, noticed the railroad was up for sale at auction, and he purchased it for $1.3 million. I don't know the exact amount that is today, but I know it's considerably higher. This photograph here was taken in the 40s of Mr. McNear at a meeting in Washington, D.C. So shortly after McNear got the railroad, he immediately started making improvements. And one of those improvements was finally getting some up-to-date locomotives. They got 4 282s from Alco. This is the first of the class number 40. They were built in 1927 and were capable of speeds up to 60, 65 miles an hour. And later on, McNear had the TPNW get some 484s numbered in the 80s, and these were the lightest 484 type locomotives in North America, and they were, I guess you could say they were semi-streamlined. The stripe running down the running board there was painted green with gold pinstripes. Originally they were going to paint it red, but the story goes that George McNear traveled to the Alco plant over in Schenectady, New York, saw the red paint, didn't like it, and ordered it to be changed to green. Older locomotives still were in service well into the McNear era. This is a second-hand locomotive from the Big Four that the TPNW got, and they used these into the late 30s, I believe. And then here's one of the, that's a 60 class 280, another older locomotive leading a freight train, I believe near East Peoria. And then the TPNW also had a few of these former Burlington 262s. I'm not a Burlington expert, but I believe these were originally built for passenger service, but the TPNW only ever used them for freight. Passenger trains were something that George McNear did not like. As I mentioned earlier, he had eliminated all of the TPNW's passenger trains by the early 1930s. For a time, though, they offered mixed train service, but that was gone by the start of World War II. McNear retained some of the passenger cars, though, for use on business and inspection trains, and he purchased this car for himself from the CB&Q. This car was built in 1890 or so for a Mexican railroad, and in 1901 it was acquired by John Bunting, a millionaire from California, who named it the Elfrida after his wife. And the Buntings used it as a private car for a while, and then it went to the Colorado and Wyoming and various other owners before going to the CB&Q and eventually to George McNear. Now, this car still survives today. It's at the Wheels of Time Museum in Peoria, and they just finished restoring it. So if you're ever in the area, that would be a place of interest to check out. So McNear was not well liked by his employees. He was very harsh and strict. This was before a lot of the labor laws that are in place now were even thought of, so McNear could get away with poor working conditions, very low wages. Strikes began in the late 1920s and just continued to get worse and worse throughout McNear's presidency. And by the early 1940s, it was so bad that McNear had the railroad seized from him by the United States government again because they needed the railroad to keep operating as the war was going on. And McNear did not like that a whole lot, and when the railroad was returned to him after the war, he went right back to treating his employees very poorly, and strikes resumed. In February 1946, the strikes were so bad, pickets were throwing bricks and rocks and whatever at trains. There weren't any related deaths to that, but I know there were some injuries. I've heard a story of a caboose in Canton, Illinois, being randomly ambushed by bricks, and the brakeman took a brick to the head. But over time, McNear started to have enough of this, and he hired armed guards that I've been told were actually just gangsters off the streets of Peoria that he hired to ride his trains with weapons to protect them from being ambushed by pickets. And in 1946, February 6, 1946, there was a armored train with bulletproof windows and other bulletproof material passing through Gridley, Illinois with armed guards. And there was a group of pickets that had been following the train since it had left the East Peoria yards. And they attempted to stop the train from proceeding eastward, and something happened and the guards started firing and 2 pickets were killed, Erwin Passion and Arthur Brown. And after that, it got really bad for a while, and then McNear was able to, from legal representatives or something along those lines, he was able to get orders from the government to get the pickets to stop striking against the railroad. And it worked for a couple months, but on March 10th, 1947, McNear was shot by an unknown assassin in front of his home on Moss Avenue in Peoria while he was walking home from a basketball game. And during that time, there was a power outage in Peoria. It was very dark, so somebody drove up in a car, shot him, and nobody ever found out who did it. The FBI got involved, and there was quite a hefty monetary reward for anyone confessing or giving information, but as far as I know, nobody ever said a word, and to this day, the murder is unsolved. So after McNear had been killed, the TPNW was ran by just a team of people for a while before this gentleman, John Russell Coulter, everybody just called him Russ. He was appointed president of the TPNW. He came from several years working in management on the Frisco, and he was persuaded to come to Peoria and take over the TPNW. So much like George McNear, almost immediately after becoming president, Coulter started to make improvements to the railroad. One of which was public advertising to kind of improve relations with the public and employees that had been damaged when McNear was president. This is TP Willie, the official mascot of the Toledo, Peoria, and Western. This started to pop up during the Coulter presidency, and Willie still remains a TPNW icon today. Bigger improvements came in December 1947 when the TPNW got its first 2 diesel locomotives. It was a F3 A and B set from EMD. They were originally used as demonstrator units, and the TPNW realized that diesel was the way of the future, so they purchased an A and B unit. EMD repainted them into TPNW colors. They were dark green and yellow, and they arrived on the TPNW property. And soon after, the railroad started purchasing a number of Alco road switchers to eventually phase out steam. By 1949, most of the steam on the TPNW was long gone off to the scrappers. This is a 280 at East Peoria waiting for shipment to Keystone Steel and Wire, which was a scrap dealer in Peoria. And on October 11th, 1950, the TPNW ran their last steam train behind one of the 484s I mentioned earlier. And shortly after that, the last remaining steam engines on the property were shipped off to Keystone to be scrapped, and the TPNW proudly started displaying this advertisement stating that they were now completely dieselized. and the TPNW was one of the first railroads in the country to achieve that. More public advertising from the 1950s. The TPNW hosted a radio show on WMBD in Peoria, and they played music, and during commercial breaks, TPNW representative would come on and give shout outs to people that had supported their TPNW served community in the Peoria area or supported the railroad directly. This was a good example of Russ Coulter's efforts to improve public and employee relations. Here's some diesel power from the early 50s. This is one of the first RS2s purchased by the TPNW in Peoria, switching out a grain elevator. Here's another RS2. This train has just crossed the Illinois River into Peoria, and it's banging across the Rock Island diamonds just south of downtown. That's Walnut Street Tower in the background. This area is almost impossible to identify today. It's just a big patch of grass with a single track and a parking lot there now. The tower is long gone. Back out east in Fairbury, this is the Honegger Feed Company plant. The TPNW's main line is off to the left there. This plant was built in 1949, 1950 to replace an earlier plant in downtown Fairbury that burned down one night. And the benefit of having it out here was that there was more room for more tracks for rail access. If you notice, there's a crane off to the right there. Right by that crane is a branch line for the Wabash that went up to Streeter from Fairbury. So this plant was served by both railroads, although I'm pretty sure a majority of all rail traffic here was handled by the TPNW. Wreck at Honegger's. This was from February 1953, I believe. I'm not entirely sure what happened, but it looks like it was a complete disaster. This is a train passing through shortly after they reopened the tracks. And if you notice, the building on the right there was the main Honegger warehouse. Today, nothing is left of the facility besides the silos in that photograph. The TPNW was also pleased with the performance of their F3s, so they turned to EMD for more units eventually. And in January of 1952, these two GP7s were built. The lead unit there, number 103, went to work for a short line in Idaho after it was on the TPNW, and it was just cut up for scrap a couple months ago. This photograph was taken in the mid-60s, I believe, in Canton, Illinois. Back at Fairbury, around Valentine's Day, 1955, this shows one of the F3s leading a GP7 and probably an RS2. They purchased a single RS3 in 1950, so that might be an RS3. I'm not too good with identifying my ALCO unit, so somebody might know for sure. This is at the location of the Fairbury Depot that I mentioned earlier. Eventually, the TPNW constructed a newer metal quote-unquote depot to replace it. It was mostly just used as an office, but that building is still there today. It's at the 4th Street crossing. Now, one of these F3s, if you remember the builder's photo I showed a minute ago, there was an A and B unit. Well, eventually the TPNW discovered that if the one A unit was out of service, the B unit couldn't operate either, and they wanted to be able to have as much power as they could. So the TPNW approached EMD about the possibility of transforming the B unit into an A unit, and EMD said, "You're nuts, it's not possible," but the TPNW thought otherwise. So I think it was in 1951-52, they took the B unit into the shop and turned it into an A unit. And when it was done, it was 3 inches shorter than the original A unit, and the nose was made of wood. Newer Alco power arrived on the TPNW in 1959. This is number 400 and RS11 at Colby, Illinois, which isn't really a town, it's more of a Y on the TPNW just north of Mapleton, Illinois. You can see the south leg of the Y splitting off to the left there. The Y split off from the main and went out to serve some industries close to the Illinois River, and the Y is still in service today. And this location where the photographer was standing is now the Colby shop and office of the Keokuk Junction Railway. Rail fans frequented the TPNW, especially during the 1960s. George McNear's private car that I showed earlier was retired not long after he was killed, and in 1949, Russ Coulter got this new business car named the Prairie Marksman to honor a past TPNW freight train that had that name. And the Prairie Marksman observation car was frequently chartered by local railroad clubs for fan trips over the TPNW. This is in Piper City, Illinois on a 1961 trip with the Central Illinois Railroad Club. Now eventually the charters became so popular that the TPNW decided they needed another business car. But instead of purchasing another passenger car, they instructed the East Peoria shop forces to build a caboose that can serve as a business car in addition to a caboose. And this car became the Prairie Marksman 2 and often traveled with the Prairie Marksman 1, the passenger car, on railroad club trips. Newer EMD power, this is a GP18 built in 1961. The 600 was the only GP18 the TPNW rostered, and as I'll mention later, the TPNW had a lot of single unit classes. Another one was the GP30. This was their only GP30 locomotive. This is at the Route 150 overpass in East Peoria. The engine's just entering one of the switches into the big TPNW yard there. This was one of the newer Alco units. In fact, yes, this was actually the newest Alco unit, number 800, a C424. They got 2 of these. The other was number 801. These 2 units were rumored to be cursed because throughout their career on the TPNW, they were involved in multiple nasty derailments and wrecks, one of which happened about a year after they were built in 1965. They hit a tanker truck at the Route 66 crossing in Chenoa, Illinois, and the 801 was almost completely destroyed. And the damage to both units was so severe that the TPNW just sent them back to Alco to be repaired. And the 800 came back first because it wasn't damaged as badly as the 801. And when the 801 came back, people noticed that it had an entirely new serial number than it had before the wreck. And there's been some speculation that the damage was so bad that they just built a new unit. In 1965, the TPNW got 3 GP35s from EMD. This is number 901, the second of the class, and this is at the fueling area at East Peoria. If you might have noticed earlier on one of the C424 slides, you may have seen a former Missouri, Kansas, Texas Alco FA coupled up to it. This photograph shows a GP35 leading one of those units, and I believe that might be the single GP40 that the TPNW owned too. The FAs were repowered with EMD units and owned by the Precision National Corporation, and they were leased to the TPNW during a power shortage in the 1960s. Here is a westbound at Gilman, Illinois, about to cross the Illinois Central main line there. That's the TPNW's freight depot on the right. Today that's just an open lot, and behind the photographer was the Illinois Central passenger station that is still standing today, used by Canadian National for offices. And there has been some talk that the freight depot on the right there may have served as the TPNW's passenger depot very early on. And then some freight car photos. Here's a 3-bay coal hopper. The TPNW had a lot of coal business, as there were several mines near Peoria. And an old stock car. This likely predated George McNear, but was still in service during the Coulter era. And a 40-foot box car. This car has been created or recreated in HO scale. And a 50 or 60-foot box car. And a caboose. The TPNW built their own bay window cabooses, and most of them are still around today in preservation. Number 523 here is on display in downtown Chatsworth. So the good times on the TPNW didn't last that long. In 1968, the TPNW was just finishing up a great decade of business, and they purchased a few SW1500 switchers, and these units were in a new red, or it's technically vermilion orange, but it looks red to me, a red and white paint scheme. And the management and employees both liked this paint scheme a lot, so eventually other units started receiving it as well, and as newer freight cars were built, they also got a similar paint job. And cabooses were also painted that way too. This number 530 here was purchased secondhand from the Santa Fe. And not long after this photograph was taken, it was involved in a fire and the cupola was removed. This car survives on a farm near Washington, Illinois today, and the cupola is still missing. So 1970 started off on a very bad foot. This is the Illinois River Bridge in Peoria after it had been hit by a barge and knocked into the river. The TPNW wanted to rebuild the bridge, but in the end decided to use trackage rights over the Peoria and Pekin Union Railway, which had a bridge of their own a little ways to the south. And this started to complicate things financially for them. And then some really bad stuff happened later on in 1970. On Father's Day, those two supposedly cursed C-424s were leading a freight train through Crescent City, Illinois, and a hot box on a Burlington hopper car overheated and caused a derailment. And several tank cars carrying liquid propane derailed. One of the couplings punctured a tank car, and the propane ignited, and unfortunately this was the result. Almost the entire downtown area of Crescent City was completely destroyed. However, miraculously, nobody was killed. And that's hard to believe after looking at this photo. This is a tank car that was blown several blocks from the tracks and landed in someone's living room. To this day, if you look around Crescent City, you can still find little bits of train cars all around town and in the farm fields surrounding the town. Not all was bad though in the 1970s. In 1976, the TPNW painted their GP30 for the bicentennial. This was one of the units from around the country that participated in that, I guess you could call it a activity of painting locomotives for that event. And my friend Scott, who runs the Little Silva shops, they do repainting for models, or I should say custom painting. He was able to replicate it in HO scale for me. Run-through power on the TPNW was pretty common during the 1970s. As I mentioned earlier, the Pennsylvania was met with the TPNW at Effner out on the east end, and on the west end, the TPNW connected with the Santa Fe via a little branch line from La Harpe to Lomax, where they met the line there, and they had access to the big yards in Fort Madison. This photograph shows a Penn Central unit leading a westbound at Colby. And in 1976, with the formation of Conrail, the Pennsylvania line to Effner was deemed unnecessary and sold to the TPNW. This photograph, I believe, is from the early 1980s, but it shows a lash-up of TPNW power at Remington, Indiana, on the former Pennsylvania. So in 1980, declining rail service, or I'm sorry, 1977, declining rail service was in full swing for the TPNW. The railroad was losing money like crazy. So they got their last president in 1977, Bob McMillan. He was an executive with the Santa Fe up in Chicago, and he came down to the TPNW in 1977 and would ultimately become the final leader of the original TPNW. Shortly after McMillan arrived, some new GP38-2 type locomotives were acquired. This is the first of the class the day after it arrived on TPNW property. Maintenance of way, despite declining revenue, was still a strong priority of Bob McMillan, and vehicles such as this brush cutter were used frequently to make sure the TPNW was in good condition. Here's a train at Canton, I believe, with some GP38-2s and some former Frisco, looks like SD7s or 9s that were being leased during another power shortage. Here's an eastbound near Eureka, shortly after some snow had fallen, with two GP38-2s and the GP18 I mentioned earlier. And here is, I think this is eastbound at Washington. The track at the bottom of the screen was a branch line of the Gulfmobile in Ohio that crossed the TPNW there. It had been abandoned a few years before this photo. In 1979, the Golden Arrow Charter Company sponsored an excursion trip over the TPNW, and for that trip, the shop forces repainted the GP30 into this paint scheme. During the repainting process, they did it right before the trip. They either ran out of time or paint and had to give it this unusual paint scheme without the big TPNW on the long hood. And shortly after the trip, it was eventually repainted to be in the traditional TPNW paint scheme. This is looking east at Effner. The train is westbound. And the train traversed the entirety of the TPNW. This is it returning back east at Bushnell. It's crossing the CB&Q. Well, at the time it was Burlington Northern. The depot on the right there has been moved to the Western Illinois Old Threshers grounds in Hamilton, Illinois, and they have one of the TPNW bay window cabooses on display next to it. So about a year later, in 1980, Golden Arrow came back and sponsored another trip over the TPNW with the newly restored nickel plate road number 765. This photograph shows it being serviced at East Peoria with some TPNW power there. The 765 was used on both freight trains and passenger trains, and when it ran from East Peoria to Keokuk, they did two separate trips, one from East Peoria to Keokuk and one from East Peoria to Effner. And on the Keokuk trip, it was discovered that the engine was too heavy to travel over the tracks west of La Harpe. So at La Harpe, it was cut off, and two Jeep 38s took it the rest of the way to Keokuk, and then back over to La Harpe, where the steam engine took over to head back east. Not long after that, the TPNW decided it would be a good idea to become a subsidiary of the Santa Fe in an attempt to save money, and rail fans immediately knew that the end was on the horizon, so they started doing mass photography sessions at the East Peoria yard. This night view is from either 1982 or 83. The photographer Roger Holmes, he just passed away a few months ago, but he was one of the big-time TPNW photographers, and he hosted a number of night photo sessions at the East Peoria yard like this one. There's another night view of some power at East Peoria, and a daytime view from Roger of a eastbound climbing up Washington Hill near Eureka. And this is one of my favorite TPNW photos. I always told him he should do a Christmas card with this one. So the Forbidden logo, in 1981, as I mentioned, the TPNW became a subsidiary of the Santa Fe, and they developed this logo for TPNW equipment and documents and everything. And they started applying it to some locomotives like these two at East Peoria. And soon after the Santa Fe management got word of what was going on, they freaked out and demanded that the TPNW stop doing that. They keep their own logo because it infringed on the Santa Fe's rights. And because of that, the TPNW had hundreds of decals with this logo on it that they just started handing out to anyone that asked for them, and I was able to obtain a couple from Roger Holmes because I'd imagine he would go to East Peoria and get anything the railroad was getting rid of. This photo is a good example of the Santa Fe transition with that FP or F45 on the right there. So in 1983, the TPNW was able to purchase a very small branch line in Morton, Illinois, several miles from their main line. And to reach the branch line, they had to use trackage rights over the Norfolk Southern. And this photo shows one of the locals that went from East Peoria to Morton to switch out industries there. And that little branch line is still in use by the TPNW today, and they still use trackage rights over the NS to get there. Now that Santa Fe caboose behind the engine was leased by the TPNW because it had special glazing on its windows. The FRA at one point or another around this time decided that all railroads had to have some sort of glazing on caboose windows, and none of the TPNW cabooses had that, so the railroad decided it would be cheaper to just lease Santa Fe cabooses that already had it than upgrade their own. On December 31st, 1983, the TPNW had its last day before it was officially merged into the Santa Fe as a whole and ceased to exist as a company. This was a result of the continuation of declining business and rising expenses. So the Santa Fe absorbed the TPNW at the end of the year, and this was the last run of the Effner local from East Peoria to Effner and back. So the Santa Fe took over the TPNW and they ran trains over it for quite a while. This is a train plowing snow in 1985. The Santa Fe, like I said, ran it for a while, and then they decided that the TPNW was not for them and put it up for sale. And in 1989, the railroad was acquired by a new company that revived the old TPNW name. Instead of being the Toledo, Peoria and Western Railroad Company, it was now the Toledo, Peoria and Western Corporation. And the president of the railroad was Gordon Fuller, who had worked for the New York Central years before. So new TPNW locomotives started appearing in the New York Central paint scheme. This is a former Bessemer and Lake Erie F7 that was acquired for use on business trains. But my understanding is when they needed power, they would just put it on freight trains too. However, when that happened, it never led because crews didn't like climbing in and out of the cab during switching moves. Here's a photograph of a typical freight engine. The TPNW used former Santa Fe GP20s because most of the original TPNW locomotives had been, well, I should say all, had either been donated or sold, and there were none left. So when the new TPNW started up, they got Santa Fe GP20s like this one and painted it in their own colors. In 1996, the Delaware Otsego Corporation gained control of the TPNW. They also owned the New York Susquehanna and Western, so locomotives in that paint scheme started appearing on TPNW trains. This photograph was taken at Hoosier Lift, a intermodal facility that was constructed near Remington, Indiana, shortly before the original TPNW went defunct in 1983. In 1999, the TPNW was purchased again by Rail America, and Rail America removed much of the uniqueness of the TPNW. Most of the East Peoria shop buildings were demolished. The turntable in East Peoria was cut up for scrap, and the unique painted locomotives were retired and mostly scrapped and replaced by locomotives wearing the generic Rail America paint scheme that was shared with other Rail America owned lines around the country. And former TPNW employees have told me that Rail America just completely obliterated all of the good stuff that the TPNW had going for it at the time. I have heard that they weren't too kind to employees and the property just deteriorated. So shortly after Rail America took over, they decided the west end from Peoria to Keokuk and the little branch line up to Lomax was not for them, and they sold it to the Keokuk Junction Railway, who still operates it today. This photograph was taken just a few months ago of a Keokuk Junction train on the TPNW, or former TPNW, near La Harpe. So the last chapter we're going to cover is the TPNW in present day. In 2012, this is Jerry Reinman. He became president of the TPNW Historical Society, which had been started by Glenn Pizer, another TPNW fan, a few years before. And Jerry ran the society for a while, but eventually he became ill and passed away, and the society sort of died with him. So for a few years there was no TPNW Historical Society, and in 2018 my friend Connor and I got together and decided we should restart it. So I cranked out the first newsletter, and the TPNW Society is now back, and we do everything digitally now, so there's no real membership due needs. So we offer free membership now and do newsletters and host events every now and then. The TPNW is still running today. As I was starting to say, in 2012, they were purchased, or I guess Rail America as a whole was purchased by Genesee and Wyoming, another company that owns multiple rail lines around the world. This photograph I took a couple years ago of a westbound passing a station sign that dates to the original TPNW from before 1983 at La Hogue, Illinois, just west of Gilman. Then here's that same train passing through Piper City. If you remember that photograph of the Prairie Marksman I showed earlier, this is taken right about at that same spot. So the area has changed quite a bit today. And here's another shot of that train passing the recently restored depot and forest. It's a very nice museum now. If you're ever in the area, I recommend checking it out. However, not all has been good for the TPNW in recent years. The Effner Depot that I showed at the beginning of the program was last used as an office in the 1980s. And when the Santa Fe took over, they just closed the doors, locked it up, and left it. And by 2018, when I took this photo, it was in very bad shape. There was some hope over the years that someone would buy it and restore it. There was serious talk of someone buying it and moving it somewhere to be a restaurant or something a number of years ago, but something happened and that plan fell through, and it just continued to sit there falling apart. And last December, right before Christmas, our fears that it would not exist anymore were finally realized. A off-season severe weather event occurred and the depot was severely damaged. The west wall fell over and the rest of the building was structurally compromised. So the day after I took this, TPNW crews came in and bulldozed it. In modern day times, the TPNW is still running quite well. Business is booming. They still run from Peoria to Logansport with a newly acquired branch line down to Kokomo, Indiana. And west of Peoria, the original TPNW line is still operated by the Keokuk Junction. While most of the historical places along the railroad have been lost to time, there are still some artifacts left. Like I said earlier, most of the cabooses were preserved, including this one, number 506. It was for years used in Fairbury, Illinois, as an office at a Christmas tree farm, and once the farm stopped doing Christmas events, it just kind of fell apart. But in 2020, while everybody was on lockdown, John Ruff, the guy in the red shirt standing under the window, purchased it or somehow acquired it, I'm not entirely sure, and moved it to his grain elevator in Toluca, Illinois, along the BNSF Transcon, put it on a nice little display track, and currently he is in the process of restoring it both inside and out, and he hopes to have a museum in it at some point. This photograph I took while I was chasing a Keokuk Junction train with some friends. This is looking down the slightly overgrown grown but still operational former TP&W main line at Elviston, Illinois. The Keokuk Junction stores a lot of grain cars here, and this is looking into the sunset at the end of the day, and that is also the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions or want additional information, or if you're interested in the TP&W Historical Society, you can contact us at tpwhistorical@gmail.com, and we'll try to answer any questions you may have. Yeah, that's about it.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate the presentation here today, and really is kind of a feel-good story about, being able to resurrect the TPW Historical Society. So excellent work in that effort as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So this is going to conclude our July presentation, and make sure and check back with us for the next show. I do not have it right in front of me at the moment, but we have lots of great material coming up on the docket for future programs. So keep checking us out and check out all the previous Iowa chapter programs. If you have been, if you're new finding the channel, make sure and see all the great material that we've already presented. So thank you, Thomas, and everyone have a good weekend. This presentation of the Iowa chapter has been brought to you by Steel Highway. Search for Steel Highway rail cams on YouTube, or go to steel-highway.com and order your copy of the magazine that every rail fan needs. Steel Highway, the magazine for the modern rail fan.